Well, all right, Damon Owens, how are you doing today?
I'm fantastic. Excited to be with you. Thanks for the
Yeah,
invitation.
welcome to the program. I'm so glad to have you here. It was really cool to be able to meet you earlier this year at the Sexual Integrity Leadership Summit in St. Louis, where you were one of the plenary session speakers, um, and really dealing with a lot of the issues around even theology of the body. You brought a great message, I think, on that. And then we had Dr. Nancy Piercy also there, really dealing with the
Yes.
issue of transgenderism. And it was just an amazing time. But I really wanted to have you on our program because I loved a lot of what you were saying as it pertained especially to this wonderful institution of marriage. And can you just let our listeners know a little bit of what you do and kind of why your emphasis is so heavily focused on marriage?
Oh, I'm delighted to. So, my beloved Melanie and I have been married for 29 years this year. We've had 8 children, and we were married in 93 and immediately got involved in marriage preparation, marriage ministry, not because we had been, deeply embedded in ministry before. It was our first time individually or even together as newlyweds in our Catholic life, our Christian life, and with the Lord was really a call. We had such an interesting marriage preparation experience. We were recent, returns to the Lord after some, really tough college and graduate school years. So we were on fire for the Lord. And we thought that this area was something not only that we could do together, but we needed. We needed the community. We needed to be around other people. So we've been involved in marriage ministry, since 1993. And the theology of the body, as you mentioned just recently, was relatively new. It was about 10 years in that I was introduced to this as a whole body of teaching. And it really fit well into marriage. It fit into our own journey to grow in holiness in marriage, but also the ability to communicate to the culture, to people at various levels of, relationship with the Lord. Ways, grasping the heart. What do they want? What do you want? You married for some lofty vision, right? Love does that to you. And yet the lived experience can be so much different, can be so different in good, bad. It just shatters expectations, regardless of where we come from. So very much the call the Lord has brought on my heart and our heart has been to journey that with couples as we're journeying ourselves. Not standing on a mountaintop saying, be like us by any means, but more of shoulder to shoulder saying there's a whole community of people who are married in the Lord. And that marriage in the Lord, it doesn't change the challenges, but it changes the experiences of the challenges. It puts the Lord in the center. So that's really the heart of everything we've done since then.
Yeah, well, and where I would love to eventually see our conversation go today is really around the issue of intimacy in marriage. Like, what is marital
Good.
intimacy? What is that oneness that we hear of in Scripture?
Yeah.
But I want to start way back at the very, very most basic question, and that is, what is marriage?
Oh, Jeff,
How
I
would you
can't tell
answer
you how
that
much.
question?
Oh, I'm so delighted you asked that question. That's one of my things when I do things secular and Christian is that there's this presumption of what marriage is that we have to that is the first question to ask, because the reality is even before the Supreme Court decision in 2014 or the series of the cultural changes, there have been so many different meanings of marriage, and we use the same word for so many meanings. So, quick answer. Marriage to the Christian is an indissoluble union of life and love that's entered by a man and a woman for their own good and for the good of the church, the world, and the Lord. So it speaks about what we call vocation, from the Latin vocare. We're called to marriage. It's deeply connected to our baptism because it's a state of life that we freely enter into that has two beautiful dynamics. One of them is it makes visible in the world a deep mystery about God himself. That God is a communion of persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in such union that they're one. This is the core of Christianity. And from the very beginning, he created marriage. Our first parents, Adam and Eve, before sin, he created marriage as a sign in the visible world of himself, of what can happen when two become one. And yet we're not God. So the other dimension is that we actually become more human. We become more in the image and likeness of God. Here's our church talk. By living out this state of life that actually forms us to teach us how to love, how to give and receive ourselves in love. And to your point on intimacy, which is another hidden secret, intimacy in our schema is the measure of that love. The vulnerability, mutual vulnerability to be in communion with one another. It's not an annihilation of two people to become something different. Mm-hmm. It's this unique union of two unique, unrepeatable persons that becomes something that never existed before. So the intimacy is a word that gets to how much can we love one another? How much can we become one, as Genesis 2 says? And how much can we love? Can we give ourselves one to the other and become what God created us to be? So that's not the bumper sticker. That's not the meme, right? But what is marriage gets to everything. That if it's not rooted in that relationship with the Lord that begins with baptism, it's something else. So to be joyful in marriage is going to have a whole different plan if what you think marriage is not rooted in that description.
And in that, and as it pertains to the conversation we're having, how critical is it that this is something that comes from God? In other words, how critical is it for us to know that marriage is actually a gift, not some kind of either man-made institution or something that was just sort of evolved societally because we thought this was a good idea? How important is it to even where we're going in terms of building that intimacy? Why is it so important that we understand that this was something from the mind and heart of God versus just something that we came up with as a good way to form society?
Yeah, Jonathan, it's essential. And I use that word meaning it's the essence of marriage. If we don't acknowledge God as the author of marriage, then we'll never accept his authority. And his authority in marriage is not one of overwhelm, right? His yoke is easy. His burden is light. But when he's the author, you go to the author to say, what does this mean? How do I live this? What do you expect from me? How do I receive whatever it is that you expect of me? And the answer to those are all positive. He expects us to receive and to give love, to experience a joy that's a fruit of love, to become more human. And if we're human in his description, then we're made in the image and likeness of him. So we become more divine. We become more like him. Not as little gods. We don't self-create because that's a whole other order. It's like self-creating marriage is the fruit of the idea that we can self-create our own identity. As a man, as a woman, I can change things. I can do this. The whole idea of self-creation has given rise to other arrangements and relationships that there's some honor to them, right? Every relationship is honorable, has a potential of honor in it. But the fullness of what marriage is deeply rooted in what God created. So it's essential to that. Now, the other piece of that is because we live in a culture that has so many different meanings of marriage, there's evidence that we see for this that those without faith don't see it. In other words, because we all desire love, it's a human universal to give and receive in love. As a Christian, we say, well, God is love. So it's built into us, this yearning and longing for God. But others say as well, it's just everywhere. So it's got nothing to do with God. It has to do with this humanity that I've come to understand through my own intellect, through my own reason, through my own experience, and I can determine what's true. Those are two irreconcilable concepts of what it means to be human. And it's two irreconcilable concepts of God. And I think this is one of the reasons why marriage and the conversations around it, morality, sexuality, children, family, divorce, adultery, contraception, I mean, name all the difficult things, homosexuality. The reason that these are so controversial is because they're so universal. And if we don't agree on that answer of what these things are, there are fundamental disagreements about, literally the reason for our existence. That's not overstating it. The whole reason for our existence flows from that author and his authority and our willingness to put ourselves under his mission, that submission, submitio to God. So marriage is the proving ground for our Catholic faith.
Now let's, a lot of times then when we actually talk specifically about this phrase, intimacy,
Hmm.
especially as it pertains to marriage, a lot of times the first thing that pops into someone's head, and Christian or non-Christian, and rightly so, is the issue of sex. So
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about why is sex, from God's perspective, only for marriage? And what does
Hmm.
that do for the building and growing of intimacy as God has designed it?
Yeah, another great question. Thank you. The we have, this is my diagnosis of the cultural problem, is that we have we're looking at all the same elements: love, marriage, sex, male, female, children, family. We're looking at all these things, and we have this desire for them at different levels, right? But one of the problems with the culture is that we have inverted what's first. In other words, I look at it as binoculars. If you look at it through binoculars, you can see things and you can draw things closer to you. It's like my autofocus here, right? I move my hands and it changes the focus, right? So when we look at things, we can draw things that are far away to become close to us. But when we reverse the binoculars, it's the opposite. Things that are close to us become further away. And I use that analogy of binoculars to say that our culture looks at love through the lens of sex, when in fact we're meant to look at sex through the lens of love.
Mhm.
And when you look at sex through the lens of love, then you start talking about things like intimacy, commitment, permanency, belonging irreplaceably to one another. When you look at love through the lens of sex, then sex is first. And everything is looked at as sexual. Intimacy is sexual. Relationships are sexual until proven otherwise. Everything that delights us in the moment is not just an experience of life, but it becomes a right. And not just a right, it becomes a demand for immediate pleasure. I have a right to immediate pleasure. That's the fruit of a culture that has placed sex as the first lens. So the first move that we have to even talk about intimacy, what you're getting at, is to reverse that view, that we need to look at sex through the lens of love. And that sexual union, sexual love is a incredible gift that God has given us, rooted first in being made male and female, and being made in male and female as a sign, if not the preeminent sign, of being made in God's image and likeness. That he created sex, male, female, when he created us. He's not sexual.
Mhm.
So when he created us, male and female, the phrase we use is, this is from the theology of the body, that God transferred into the visible reality of the world the invisible mystery hidden in him eternally, and thus be a sign of it. So our very bodies are made male and female. The ability of having a male and a female that can become one flesh, be one, that's not just poetic. It's not just anecdote. There's something very ontological. It's about our being. And it's interesting that intimacy, that ability to be so close in communion, has the power to create new life.
Mm-hmm.
Not always. Just the fact that it's possible, Jonathan, should put us on our knees. That God has placed in this particular type of love, the sexual union, the sexual love, the ability to create new life. And you can observe just by that, by saying that love and life then are interwoven. Life and love are interwoven. Our life is measured by the depth of our ability to love, intimacy. And love itself has the ability to give us and others life, both in quality and quantity, because of the sexual power. So the 10,000 foot view, you can see that intimacy, rightly understood, is the difference between life and death.
Well, as you're saying that, the thing that popped into my head was a little bit of what you said earlier and about self-creation. And
Yeah,
isn't it an interesting distinction that from that false notion of self-creation, you do not have that power to create new life?
that's exactly right.
There's a sense in which God has made it where it must be relational in
Mm-hmm.
order for there to be that power that capable that's capable of creating new life. And can you talk a little bit too, because I think this is really important. Can you talk a little bit too about how all these elements that you've been sharing about marriage are so directly connected even to the gospel that the idea of covenant, the idea of even how you mentioned sexual intimacy and how there's the power of creating new life. Well, is that not what Christ does in his union with us, is creating new life? Can you talk about some of the parallels and why that's important to also know when a couple is seeking to say, number one, we'd like to build greater intimacy in our marriage, but number two, we'd like to know where there are gaps or brokenness in our intimacy.
Yes.
And why is it important that the picture that God gives us of marriage actually is connected to the gospel?
Oh, this is so beautiful, John. It's so beautiful. First of all, just be clear, we're talking based on your question about a presumption of belief, right? That we're
Right.
believers. We had some relationship with God, because that is first position. That's first principle. So now we desire to live our marriages in according to the scriptures, in accordance with that relationship with the Lord and with our church. So with all of that, the question becomes more of like, how do we do this? As opposed to, what must we do?
Right.
You know,
exactly.
it's a different posture, because in much of the marriage preparation, you can't presume belief. So you have to say, what's your heart's desire? But as believers, we know what our heart's desire is. It's love, peace, joy. It's hope. It's faith in God that we can live eternally with him, with the fullness of life and love and the vision of God. So we share that with that belief. So with that in mind, we can look at the scriptures and see the central role of marriage in how God conveys this salvation, this gift of life and love. That he started with marriage in the beginning of our scriptures. The origin story, whether it's Genesis 1 or Genesis 2, is a story about how the created world came to be, specifically as an intentional act from God. And it wasn't about commandments. It wasn't about law. It wasn't doctrine. It wasn't necessarily dogma. This was God sharing our origin story, who we are. And that story, Genesis 2, begins with the marriage. The marriage of Adam and Eve is the first story. The scriptures end, the last book in the New Testament, book of Revelation, it ends in a marriage. The marriage of Christ, the bridegroom, and the church is the bride. And if you read John's letter there, his vision there in Revelation, all of heaven is the wedding feast. Mm-hmm. It's the wedding feast of the Lamb. So let's take these bookends. The natural marriage of Adam and Eve in the beginning of Scripture, the supernatural marriage of Christ the bridegroom and the church as the bride is the end. So we have our origin and our destiny described through the lens of marriage. Then we can move in to St. Paul, Ephesians chapter 5. He mentions these in other ways, but 5:21-23, where he says in that great story of marriage in Ephesians, right, where it's essentially the marriage of the two marriages, where he says, and this is a great mystery, after speaking about wives, be submissive to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And this is a great mystery. And I mean in reference to Christ and the church. So it's as if he's marrying the end of this marriage of Christ, the bridegroom, and this natural marriage of Adam and Eve, and saying it's very much a hinge between the two. That our lived experience here is how we bridge and participate in the salvation story of God. And we can do that with a deeper understanding and experience of marriage. Now, there are other analogies in scriptures, right? But I think there's a pride of place when it comes to speaking about marriage and the salvation plan that makes every mundane, every annoyance, every difficulty in marriage that we experience right now worthy of everything we have to work out our salvation in fear and trembling, as St. Paul says elsewhere, right? So I think he elevates the truth about what marriage is right now when we can rightly place its origin and its destiny in God's salvation plan.
That's great. So let's start to come out of the clouds, come out of the 10,000 foot view, and let's start talking to those couples where they're at. And I'd love to start in that part of the conversation of asking the question, if you were to have to start to kind of outline the really fundamental key principles and maybe even practices of building intimacy in marriage, where would you start and what would you say?
Yeah. So again, presuming belief, Christians, scriptural and biblical desire to live marriage. that regardless of the difficulties, and there's some real difficulties people have in marriage, real wounds, hurts, addictions, abuse. It's a very humbling ministry to be in marriage, and often humiliating, because to see yourself and some of this brokenness in other people, it keeps you from staying in those clouds that you just talked about. It keeps you from over spiritualizing real human challenges, but also from keeping human what really is a divine vocation. So it kind of keeps the balance. So with the couples, what we begin, particularly in Joyful Ever After, our ministry, something we call epic intimacy. And it's emotional, physical, intellectual, and communicative intimacy. Now, a lot of this is based on research, secular research, as well as good Christian therapists who understand what needs to be overcome, what needs to be perfected in this day and age for two people who desire to live a Christian marriage. How do we do it? And there's things we need to deal with regarding time, regarding priorities, regarding expectations of what marriage is. We need to work on the addictions that we have. The presumption is we all have an addiction, and I don't mean to level. There are various levels of addiction, right? Some more debilitating than others. But understanding addiction as being a habit that should be a virtue, a good habit leading to the good, but it leans toward a vice, or at least it's not a virtue, in that it's a habit that we do when we're lonely, mad, sad, bored, tired, angry. We have these emotional states, and there's things we do. Sometimes it could be food. Sometimes it's drink. Sometimes it's television. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a book. Sometimes it's running. Sometimes, so the thing itself doesn't have to be good or bad. It's just in those moments of us entering real challenge and difficulty, what do we lean toward to get out of that difficulty? So in marriage, we confront this, because when two promise to be one at the altar, this place of life and death, or I should say this place of life from death, right? The altar, sacrifice, that we don't know, there's no roadmap to specifically how I am Damon Owens to be Melanie's husband, how Melanie is to be Damon's husband. We have principles. But every moment of our marriage is a revelation. Every conflict is an opportunity. Every delight is a confirmation, because we're created for joy, and joy is the fruit of love, and peace is the fruit of right order. So joy, love, and peace are what these epic intimacy, emotional on the level, the physical level, the intellectual, getting to know one another, communicative, both in skills and other things. So the first place to your question of where I start is really getting a snapshot of who's in front of me. Who are you? What are the things that you've discovered about yourself? What have you discovered about your spouse in the weeks, years of marriage? And what are the things that really frustrate you? And what are the things that really delight you? See, each of those tells a story, Jonathan, about ourselves and about our other. And that to me is the starting point for growing deeper into intimacy. And we need to look at those specifics in light of our broader culture to get sort of a map of what to do next, of what to prioritize next. So that's where we start. It's very custom, very specific.
Yeah. So, and I love that. I love that, the epic kind of framework for that. In the couples that you guys have served, what are some of the key hurdles or challenges that you see in couples when you are trying to navigate them through an understanding of this epic marriage, this really thriving, growing, intimate relationship? What are some of the key challenges that you see, maybe as it relates to any one of those four elements of epic, or just to the whole thing in general?
Yeah, good question. And the challenge is that every couple is so unique, and yet there are patterns that emerge across couples. And Melanie and I have talked about this, about how much of that sort of memory do we keep, by still honoring each couple unique as unrepeatable, but also bringing in some broader cultural things. So I'll answer the question. Just to be sensitive to, the uniqueness of each couple. There are some things that we do see, based on those who have already come to us, and, as we continue to learn more. One of the big things, and it's in these things are in stages, or we call seasons of marriage. So in the first, few years of marriage, 3 to 5 years, depending on the children, there's this early stage of marriage where the biggest issues are expectations and dealing with dashed expectations of the realities of marriage. And we joke about it. People joke about it all the time, but there's a real hurt. There's a real wound when your expectation of how you're loved and to be loved is not being met. So there's an urgency there. And the Gottman Institute, a wonderful secular marriage research group, says the average couple spends 6 years of unhappiness before they reach out for help. That's a long time.
Yeah.
So these early years are about managing expectations. What did you think you were going to get? What did you think marriage was? Who did you think you were marrying? And getting them really on the same page for this common goal of marriage. Later on, the children become the issue, in that it's a serious navigation to now let love create new life, to grow your family, and what we call the tyranny of the immediate, the tyranny of the moment with kids and the demands of that, and how we really need to be attentive and intentional in how we place and keep our marriages first, and to continue the work even while you'll never be in balance. There's no such thing as balance in life or in marriage, but you have reorientation when you get disoriented. So there's disorientation. We lose our bearings because we're dealing with the thing in the moment. So the reorientation becomes sort of keeping that North Star of what your marriage is, so that when you're out of orientation, you can move back. And then when you drift another way, you can move back. And kids, there's nothing like kids in these years to disorient marriages when we're not attentive and intentional about it. Melanie and I have suffered that for a few decades now, just allowing ourselves to just drift apart when the demands and the needs of the family and finances and work come into that. And we do this all the time, and we drift all the time. So there's an acknowledgement with that.
That's actually one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is even just personally, and you can just pick anything. I was going to say, what's maybe one, challenge that you and Melanie have hit, and how did you press through that, or what does it look like to press through that with this idea of we were made for joy, we were made for love, we have this hope. Can you give any examples? I mean, not with getting too personal, but just the idea of, because one of the things we love to do around here is say, listen, story is what builds the bridge between our lives. And so
Love it.
If there's something personal that can come out, I know our listeners would love to hear it, just because, again, they want to go, now, is this guy talking as somebody who's like walked this path, or is he talking as somebody who's just academically,
and that's what I want to know when I'm listening to people. No, I get it. I think the biggest thing, and this is past and present in our marriage, is we're so different. I'm very much an extrovert. I'm very out there. I say what I mean what I say. And when I don't, I feel like a lack and I've got to correct it. I mean, Melanie is very much an introvert. She's not shy, but she could literally spend hours, days, weeks contemplating something and then forming. So that's been a huge thing. So right around 2013, I'm out in full-time ministry and I'm traveling a lot. Coming home and I'm thinking I'm doing, both. I'm getting, the street lights are all lit, out in the ministry, and the house is all lit and lamp. And I had Melanie came and just said, we're a mess. The family is a mess. And the girls need you. We have 8 children, 7 daughters, and a son, 2 youngest ones through adoption. So there were always some issues that we were working through. But 2013 was a watershed year, because in my blindness, I called the family together when I was there and asked them blankly, pointedly, where are you guys? And where's your heart? Have I hurt you? And they didn't want to say anything, because these were young teenagers, and they knew the work that I do with marriage and family, and they knew how important it was. And but when we really got down to it, they had come to the resolve that Dad is just not around. Dad's not around. We can't count on him being around. He's got a certain level of patience. He's tired when he comes home. He's anxious before he leaves. And the reality is that that dad, we don't expect dad to be around anymore. And I don't know how that resonates with your listeners or viewers, but even saying this 9 years later is like a sword in my heart. It's a sword in my heart. And to hear it from them, it rocked me of just, and part of it was like, oh, I'm a failure. I wanted to be, I'm not what I thought I was. I'm not as engaged, as thoughtful. I'm teaching these lofty things out to the world and getting all this recognition and failing at that specific thing in my own house. And I ended up literally canceling a year's worth of talks. I took the entire 2013 and part of 2014 off just to be at home. And anybody who's in ministry knows that's okay, Lord, let's help me.
Right.
But it was that jolting. And turns out that the fruit of that disconnect with my children was sourced in the disconnect with Melanie. Mm-hmm. And that she was able during that year to really talk in her heart about how I've not been there for her emotionally, how, my needs, when I need something, I'll just say it and make it clear. She doesn't operate that way. There's a certain anticipation that she looks for. She knows you have to speak your needs. That's clear. But there's a different way that's lived. Her love language is very much physical touch and presence, time spent. Quality time. And that difference in mine's words of affirmation, primary, and physical touch, secondary. So when my needs are met and hers aren't, it causes deep wound. And this has been going on for, she went back to like 1996. It was like 15 years of this lack and this hurt and this wound. So that year became where we really were intentional about putting our marriage first, about addressing things we hadn't in at that point, 20 years of marriage. And the fruit from that, and it was slow, but the fruit from that in these last 9 years has been just remarkable.
Yeah.
And, we've fallen, we've gotten into points where I've been just despairing, like, I've been doing this. How can this not be? I've done everything I can, the woe is me, Damon stuff. I'm trying, but it really is this work that, when I'm not humble, when there's not a level of humility, that's when the humiliation comes in, right? There will be a leveling. There will be a reckoning, right? The ground is level at the foot of the cross. But, I find that it really is my pride in, showing up in all the different ways that keeps me from being attentive, being more attentive, of being more, giving, being more loving. So this is what we're working on. It's 2022. This is what we're working on right now. Attentiveness.
Well, and I appreciate you sharing that with us, and I appreciate the fact that it illustrates to us something that I think is very important as married couples who do want that joyful life, do want that intimacy in our marriages. Is that marriage is not something that you can set it and forget it.
That's right.
It is a constantly need. It's got a constant need for cultivation, right? Mm-hmm. And so I love the fact that you just gave us a little snapshot of what does that look like over 29 years. And there was a period in there was like, man, something had kind of been unaddressed for a long time, and then but when it did get addressed, there was fruit that came from that, because there is that attitude of we're in this together, right? There's a oneness there that says, what's the old traditional vows, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, like we're in this thing all the way through. So as we wrap up here, we've only got a couple minutes left. I would love for you to share with our listeners where they can get more information specifically about the Epic Challenge, and then just anything else about your ministry and what you're doing and resources that you'd like to share.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the central place is Joyful Ever After, one word, joyfuleverafter.org, or you can go right to Epic, EPIC, epicintimacy.org, and we have a free 4-day challenge, email drop, 10 minutes a day for samples of each of these: emotional, physical, intellectual, and communicative intimacy. So epicintimacy.org or joyfuleverafter.org, and that's where we keep all the goods.
Yeah, awesome. Any final words of encouragement that you want to give to a couple out there that is just
Mm,
Hey, wherever they may be on this spectrum,
mm.
anything that you would want to say to try to encourage them to keep pressing forward in building deeper intimacy in the relationship?
Yeah, two things just popped in my head. One, you are not alone. As lonely and frustrating as marriage can be as a wife and as a husband, as disconnected and sense of, of failure and isolation, of hurts and wounds, you are not alone. And one of the great gifts we have as a church, as believers in Christ, is the call, not just the ability, but the call to enter into real friendship and community. It won't be with hundreds, but all of us needs that circle of friends that we can be authentic friends with, intimate friends who are marriage supporting, who we can speak to, either older with their wisdom or younger to be encouragers, or peers to be able to be heard in a way, individually or together. But we're not meant to live this alone. And the second part of that is just the truth that God called you to marriage, and the challenges that we have in marriage, He will be there with us, and the challenges that we have to to become what He's created us to be are meant to be brought to Him. So God is with you first and foremost, but our vision with Joyful Ever After has always been a community of like-minded believers, marriage friendly, that changes the culture.
Yeah. Well, Damon, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a joy to have you on here, and I believe this is going to be incredibly beneficial to all of our listeners. So thank you.
Oh, would to God. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah. And listeners, we're always glad that you're with us, and we will put all of this in the show notes. I really encourage you to go take the Epic Challenge. And if you need more help along your journey, feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to seeing you back here again next time on the Pure Sex Radio program. Take care.